New episode of Read More Comics, Moore. Today we're going to be talking about Superman, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow. Tom Scioli is the glaring omission here because he's working hard on Kirby, and it caught up to him. When he left our last recording session, he said, I got 2 hours of sleep last night, and you can't sustain that before catching a cold and being bedridden for a day or two, man. So sad he's not here, but I have Jim Mahfood and Ben Mara in the house, and we're going to be talking about Superman number 423 and Action Comics number 583. This is right before John Byrne begins his 6-issue miniseries, kind of like reinventing the Superman character. And what a heck of a swan song this is, man.
Oh, yeah.
First question, guys. Have you ever read these two issues?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes, I have. I read them when I was a kid. I didn't mean to interrupt you, Ben. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yes, I have in the past. But I read them when I was in grad school, I think.
Nice. Yeah. Someone handed me these when I was like a teenager, and I was kind of in my DC phase, right in the mid-late 80s, Dark Knight, Watchmen, all that was hitting, and I'd kind of converted from Marvel to DC at that time, and this was two like hidden gem Alan Moore things that only guys that hung out at the comic shop knew about.
Yeah, like what if 1% of the Marvel DC books you have in your long boxes were half as good as as these things, man.
Yeah, man, rereading these, I mean, these are a treat. These are something I would recommend to any fan of comics. You don't have to be a Superman fan. I'm not a huge Superman fan, but as far as like superhero American comics go, like I don't know if it gets much better than this.
Yeah, I agree. Like I was never a DC fan growing up, other than the Frank Miller stuff. I was more like Marvel, like Todd McFarlane and Jim Lee. And when I read this, it was I wasn't a Superman fan at all. I had and I read these, and even though you know just enough about Superman just because he's ubiquitous in our popular culture, these books like really made me care about what happened to Superman. And I hadn't been reading anything about Superman for his entire history.
Right.
Speaking of his entire history, we have these two issues are edited by Julie Schwartz, who edited hundreds probably of very milquetoast, lukewarm Superman comics. So imagine what it must have been like for him when he got like some actual good Superman comics come across his desk, after basically 50 years in the game or so. He started off as like a book agent. Like he was around since the pulp days, this Julie Schwartz guy. And in fact, there are documentaries out there about H.P. Lovecraft where his name comes up as being almost like a literary agent for the early H.P. Lovecraft stuff. That kind of ripped that material from the pulps and placed it in like the paperback universe at like Arkham House and shit. Like Julie Schwartz is part of that,
That's amazing. So, and Julie was the one who sort of spearheaded the Silver Age movement beginning at DC in the 60s with the relaunch of like Flash and all that stuff. Am I correct in saying that? Is he kind of...
Yeah, I think that's about as close as we'll get in this conversation, because I'm not too deep into the history of that. Somebody will put something in the comments to clarify.
I was just going to say, a Kayfaber can comment below on that and school us, and I would appreciate that.
But he definitely was, like I said, very steeped in science fiction, very steeped in fandom from the earliest days. Like, it was the precursor to the comic convention was the sci-fi convention, and the first fanzines were science fiction fanzines, and that's where Julie Schwartz cut his teeth. So he knows all the tricks and the tropes, and Alan Moore's a well-read motherfucker, man, and he is too. So his love his love of Lovecraft, I bet, factors into the relationship with Schwartz as well. And shit, man, we should just get right into things, man. One thing that I need to come up in this conversation, Benjamin Mara, is in an earlier recording, we were talking, you brought up the idea about how generic artwork like really lends well to the Alan Moore story. And generic, we are not using that in a pejorative sense.
No, only in an identifiable sense.
Right. And I would like to hear what your thoughts are on this 2-issue storyline, and maybe even how this Kurt Swan work feels to you when it's inked by George Perez in the first half, and then Kurt Schaffenberger or whoever that is who inks the second piece, man.
So I actually wrote down a bunch of stuff about this, mostly in comparison to Kirby, because Swan and Kirby are peers in many regards. I think Swan probably started his career a little bit after Kirby did, but they were both big in like the 60s and 70s and up into the 80s. But for me, like, Swan is the DC version of Kirby, where Kirby is sort of both. I think Swan and Kirby's personalities both exemplify each of those publishing houses. Like Kirby is like really dynamic, where Swan is like really like plain, Kirby's like dynamism, where he forces the reader to sort of like fall into the panel, where Swan is more about like plainness and distance from the subject matter. And one thing about DC Comics that I always feel like I can identify DC Comic is how many panels have full figures in them on a page. Right. Whereas like Marvel characters, there's like really close up panels, there's characters that are really far in the distance and then characters very, very close to the reader. And I think that Kirby was the one who really started that depth of field within the panel. But with Swan, there almost feels like a flatness to it. Everything is proportioned in such a way where it feels like you're observing things not from inside the action, but like at a distance from the action. And while Kirby's like cartooning is like, it starts to veer into some kind of weird language of abstraction. Right. Swan is really just about naturalism the whole time. And it's just really, really strange. Like looking at Swan stuff, I came to it late, and Kirby has obviously is a huge influence on all of us as comic book artists, but Swan now has become more of an inspiration for me in my work, which is a strange kind of feeling. Let me see. I'm just checking my notes to see if I have anything else written down. But that's pretty much it. Like Swan is like really about like wholesomeness, and Kirby's like really just about like style and energy. And Swan's almost like an anti-style to me. And I don't know. It's just, and I think that it's really sad too, these books, because this is pretty much essentially Swan's last books with DC. He goes on to do a few more projects with them, but nothing. They don't give him anything nearly as big as like his Superman run, and don't entrust him to like handle any sort of like mainstream or popular characters. Like he doesn't get to draw Batman. He doesn't get to draw like Detective Comics, going forward. I mean, he draws a few like miniseries here and there, but this is like his retirement, his forced retirement. And that's something that Kirby and he share, is just like this, ejection from their publishing houses in like a really sad way.
How long was Swan working on Superman? It was decades, right?
Decades, like 60s, 70s, up until the mid 80s, up until this book. So yeah, he's drawn like hundreds of Superman stories. And I gotta say, I went back after I read these, when I first read them. My friends and I would go to this like, old school comic shop in New York and buy 1970s Superman stories because they were so fucking weird and strange and so opposite all of the other stories we had ever read. And they were very science fiction based. Like, it was just very, very strange, almost surreal stuff, because they obviously couldn't figure out what to do with the character anymore. And they just were putting him in the most outlandish situations that they could come up with, which I thought was super entertaining. And then I feel like Grant Morrison's Absolute Superman is kind of a reconstruction of those 70s era Superman stories with way more character sort of attention.
Yeah, there's something going on with these two books that it's representing the old school morphing into the mid 80s new school comics and DC itself. And it literally is passing of the guard. Like, okay, Kurt, we're going to let you draw these sort of like last two issues of the old school Superman. And we're going to bring in the new guard, John Byrne, on Man of Steel after this. But even in 423, which we're talking about right now, having new school artist George Perez inking Kurt Swan. George's inks on this are so overpowering in a good way that the art in this almost looks like this is just a George Perez drawn book. But I think the art in this is absolutely gorgeous. It looks fantastic. You still have traces of Kurt in there and his storytelling and sensibility, but there is this strange like mixing and matching and passing of the torch going on in these books, to me anyway.
We're taking a look at the issues of these comics rather than, any of the collections that were put out recently. So we have some of the back matter attached to these issues. And in this first part, back inside cover, there is an ad for Infinity Incorporated with the young Todd McFarlane, Yeah. So we are into 86. Miller, Mazzucchelli going to be doing their thing on Batman. Dark Knight Returns happens this year, and it's John Byrne who's going to be on that Superman relaunch. It's like they are doing what they can to like add that Marvel energy. Like, this is where the industry has to go. Marvel's been number one for since 1961. We gotta do something about this, and they did. They tossed the old cats out, man. Now we don't have to do this in a page by page kind of way. Like, we could handle this conversation in the macro rather than just going page by page like we did with some of the Miracle Man shit. But we land immediately on the Superman cover for 423. And the format of that is like that great Mort Weisinger era Superman cover format, which to me ranks as like number 2 in your list of like, if you're not a cartoonist unless you ... when it comes to the cover nods. Because like number 1 is like everybody has to do their EC cover where, you cut the top masthead off and then have the title, and then you have like, a little circle with 3 interior pieces from the comic. And then this is like the second one that you got to do, man, where you have that like main interior figure and then, these other panels that kind of adorn either side.
Totally agree.
With that very, very distinct lettering. What's interesting is like that was a format spearheaded by Mort Weisinger at DC Comics, and there was like specific fonts and shit that were hand lettering, of course, but specific kinds of typesetting and hand styles. And it's like whoever did that must be dead or something, man, because they didn't capture that. They messed that part up,
Right.
One of the panels on this cover that cracked me up was the lower left, where it's like the killing of Clark Kent.
Yeah.
Like, holy shit. Could you imagine being like 10 years old, being a Superman fan, you pick up this comic, it's like, oh, fuck. Clark Kent. I mean, comic covers have done this before, but this is sort of like historic last issue, it says. And then we also have major shit going down on the cover. If you're a kid, you might actually believe, this stuff is going down. It just kind of made me laugh,
This makes me think, especially after Moore's '63 run. That this feels like a satire.
Absolutely.
From Moore, you know, to like as like a send up of like classic Superman covers.
I think the whole piece has satirical value and is kind of like completely tongue in cheek. You know, he's using some language in here like, "Hey, Superman, we just came from the 30th century," and shit like that, where it's just you know, Moore as a writer, and you could imagine sort of what he's thinking when he injects a line like that.
I agree with you completely. However, when he does it, it comes from like a place of love rather than a place of like disdain. You never feel like he's making fun of old Superman comics. It's almost like, no, this is how an old Superman comic should sound, even if it does sound silly. You know, like this is the true sort of voice of this world.
I'm glad you said that, because I would have hated to have been confused for saying that it was some kind of, you know, nonsense, like an ironic interpretation of, or just like a satire of the Superman character, or, you know, something like that. This isn't the Klaus version of Superman. No. You know, this is Alan Moore who has reverence for that pulp kind of material.
Although I would love to see that Klaus version, though. I mean, especially Dan Klaus drawing an Alan Moore written Superman. That would be incredible. That would be
the closest
amazing.
The closest we ever got was Klaus did the earliest version of the cover for Bizarro Comics, the one that ultimately went to the it was like a Matt Groening guy who did that cover, but he did the original, and I think it is a Bizarro that is the main figure inside the portrait there. But the initial paragraph that is written by Alan Moore that has to mention how this is just an imaginary story a million times. This to me is like a dog whistle of him, just like maybe even not. I don't want to say dissing DC editorial, but kind of like putting some glancing blows in there, some little jabs in there. Like, yeah, it's all imaginary. It's all made up. Like, why do we have to be so precious with this? It's almost like a small note to the corporate heads who are these gatekeepers of these properties. Even in '86, you know, this is the post Dick Donner film era, man, where Superman is definitely a property that is to be mined, and I detect like little bits of that in this opening statement, and it also reminded me just like of you know, when I was doing that X-Men Grand Design stuff, and I would change things from the original comics to kind of fit my story needs, and people would hit me up on social media or email and ask if, you know, did Cyclops really do that? And I'm like, well, Cyclops didn't really do shit. What are you talking about, man?
Yeah. I think Alan Moore's like attitude toward this subject matter is, I think it's so perfect to me. This is how like superhero comics should be written, and it's just too bad that not everybody has that same kind of attitude. And the guys that probably were the originators, who Alan Moore is totally paying homage to, didn't know that what they were doing at the time and are too long gone to, you know, resurrect. But I wish that there was more of it, and there's not. Right. There's just very, very precious few issues.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I think, excuse me. When Tom and I did the episode about the Dave Gibbons annual, you know, for The Man Who Has Everything or whatever it's called, Tom said something like, you know, this should be the standard for what superhero comics is, and unfortunately, it is the exception. Right. You know, in this era where these are licensable properties that transcend the comic book medium, at least in the 1980s, many of the people involved, like, they wanted to be, comic book artists, comic book writers. And it seems like even like nowadays, even the comic book medium for a lot of people involved in comics, and especially the writing part, I'm very critical of the writing of comics way more than the artwork in the corporate landscape. And a lot of the writers, man, they're just using comics as like a springboard into other media themselves. So it's real dangerous territory whenever you have like the corporate bigwigs who are just kind of keeping this thing going, because in all honesty, all that corporate comics is the cheapest research and development team that you can cobble together to create potential blockbuster ideas. Hollywood wishes they could pay some people as cheap as they do people in comics. But it's pretty clear that, especially if you just like look at anybody's Twitter, and they talk about, this novel they're writing or this TV show that they're pitching or this film script that they wrote. And, it's like, let's keep the eyes on the prize, man. If you're taking a check for this, man, like I want your undivided attention, and I want you to show and prove. And that's what Alan Moore does right here, man. It's like, he'll take the check, he'll do the job. This is one of his few gigs that has the motherfucking Comics Code Authority stamp on it.
Right.
But he's
it's
like
rare to see on his work.
Even the Swamp Things, like there's a very precious few of the Swamp Things that have that Comics Code logo. But he's still Alan Moore, and he's still gonna put some crazy shit in here, man.
Another thing I'd like to point out, if this existed today we have like the Death of Superman sort of event that happened a little bit later, but if these two issues were going to happen today, they would plan it as like a 2-year event that would have like dozens of books attached to it. All of it would, and none of it would even come close to the storytelling power of just these like 44 to 48 pages, that he has right here. It's just amazing, like how decompression can really just weaken a story in comics.
Yeah, you're right. It would be a 2-year multi-title crossover event or whatever. That stuff alienates new readers.
Yeah.
You can't just jump on board and be like, oh, I like Superman. Maybe I'll see what the comics are about.
Yeah.
Good luck with that.
Absolutely. As a kid, I picked up Batman comics routinely my entire young life. I have almost a full long box of like the exact Batman comics that I was picking up like every month, and it stops at nightfall whenever Batman gets his back broken. Because now you want me to go read Robin comics, and you want me to go read Catwoman, and all this other stuff. My 11-year-old dollar can only be stretched so far. And like, I had a lot of rules when it came to comics as a little boy. And one of the things I would do when I would go to the drugstore to scoop them up, I would look on that last page and see if it said "to be continued" or "the end." And the one that said "end" would end up with me far faster than anything that said "to be continued." For those obvious reasons of not knowing if you would even be able to see the next issue, the dicey distribution of the newsstand.
Right.
But one of the most kind of like abysmal treatments of the reader was, I don't know if they still do this, but in the 90s, there would be 4 Superman titles, and they would come out weekly, and the stories would fold into a complete other creative team's, sensibility, from like adventure, from Superman to Adventures of Superman to Action Comics.
They had the little diamonds on the covers.
Exactly.
That were numbered, that indicated what number in the story. I mean, honestly, dude, I am a little ashamed to admit this, but I was buying Batman and Superman at that time, and I was one of those kids that was kind of suckered into buying like almost weekly Superman comics because I was enjoying the comics at that time, and I quit collecting when they killed him off because it was like okay, now this is just a whole other thing. Now we're supposed to buy Superman comics and he's not even in them, and now suddenly there's a mullet Superman. I don't know what the fuck's going on anymore. But I was enough of a DC head at that time that I was buying, and Batman was the shit because like Norm Breyfogle was drawing like Detective Comics, and those were for the most part standalone issues where it's like, if you like Batman, here's an issue of him kicking ass, and then it ends. Maybe it's a two-parter, but Batman and Detective were separate titles.
Yeah.
The Superman thing, that became a real tricky, weird, kind of sneaky way of putting out weekly comics. I don't know. It was strange.
I bring it up specifically because we're taking a look at an issue of Superman. We're taking a look at Action Comics. And both of them are written by Alan Moore, man. So
yeah,
right, and drawn, penciled by Kurt Swan.
Right.
Can we comment on the beginning sequence with Lois and this reporter from the Daily Planet, where the '80s idea of the future, filtered through the eyes of an older man, Kurt Swan, is like Lois is wearing some ruffled prom dress thing. That's his idea of like what women in the future will wear, and there's like it looks like in their living room there's some sort of like disco ball record player, coffee maker dome thing.
That's the coffee maker.
I like, but I like all that. I like that this is during the edgy mid '80s era of comics and Dark Knight Returns and shit, and we still have kind of an awkward, outdated design sense happening here from the old guard, from Kurt Swan, but it's okay, It works for me.
I think like Kurt Swan is like the master to me of like the establishing shot, and that shot of the living room where you see where everybody is, you see the couch, and you see that weird, dome coffee maker, which in the next panel she then employs to make coffee. I think that like that sort of transition from an establishing shot to like an action, it doesn't really happen. I don't see that in comics very much anymore, and I just love seeing it in this one.
I think it's totally worth noting these initial 2 pages because it is a conversation that we are witnessing, and it could be deployed visually in a very boring way. It could be talking heads. It could be 2 people sitting there jabbering, and it's not. There's action going on. There's life being led. She's making the coffee. She's bringing it to him. She's, passing him a cup. She's got a cup herself. Something as simple as that adds more life to a comic than what you do see in situations like this in many comics, where if the writer doesn't tell the artist to do it, it might not get in there unless the artist is feeling very ambitious. That's the death of the Marvel method, where the artist was tasked with like adding a lot to the story. In this panel-to-panel breakdown universe that we live in, that is a rare thing. That said, Alan Moore is a panel-to-panel writer, as far as I know, pretty much exclusively. So worth noting that kind of acting, I guess we'll call it, is in here and is seen throughout.
It's a great choice. It's an interesting choice to set this opening scene, which becomes like, the framing device for the entire narrative. It's an interview with Lois Lane in the future. And what's great about it is Moore is able to inject all this subtext into their conversation. And he also uses the visual medium to give us more information. Like we have this panel where we see Lois has a baby. We know that she's now married to somebody else, supposedly, and she's talking about, her ex Superman. And so we're getting all this information that isn't necessarily like expository, caption boxes just telling us like what's happening. And even in modern comics where people just speak in exposition, there's like a layered aspect to the interview. Not only that, the writing is super readable. Like this dialogue is really fun to read just on the page. I want to read more of it. Like there's something about Alan Moore's dialogue and even his caption stuff, just like his prose stuff. Something about that super readable that is just like his word or his sentence structuring or just like his word positioning that just makes it really enjoyable.
Yeah. This stuff is so easily digestible. It is a pleasure to read, a pleasure to look at. These faces inked by George Perez in this section are just gorgeous. Looks so great. And then after 2 pages of just dialogue, you're rewarded by turning the page and you get this gorgeous action shot of Superman flying in. The shit has hit the fan. The city's on fire. Jimmy and Lois are there to fill him in on the situation. And it's like, okay, boom, you're in the comic now. Here's Superman. And you are instantly drawn in by like, what the hell is happening now?
When you see the George Perez inked Kurt Swan Supermans, it's this amazing clash because the stockiness of the figure, it's like you could see the Kurt Swan is in there somewhere, but then you see, and we know the George Perez interpretation of what Superman looks like. So it's just like, I just can't help but stare at it every time it shows up because it's this incredible clash that feels like a third artist, It feels like somebody completely different.
Yeah. I love it. I think it is a weird, strange mix, but George is still being respectful to Kurt, but he can't help but be George Perez, so he's going to define the muscles and he's going to do like 80s superhero bodies on these heroic characters. He can't not do that.
There's like a meticulousness and obsessiveness to it that I really love. Like it's one of the reasons why like I love Paul Gulacy's Master of Kung Fu. It's just like going so hard on every panel, on every page. There is some nice restraint in Perez's stuff where he does let some of it breathe a little bit. But I think Murphy Anderson is Swan's best inker, and he has like more of like a more, I don't know, lighter touch on some of how he handles Swan's figures and forms. But there's something about Perez's like just compulsive inking quality to these pages that I really like a lot. It's like he's really trying to bring it.
Part of Moore's writing, I have to imagine, is I have 48 pages or however many pages I have. What are my favorite Superman villains? I gotta find a way to get them all in here for at least a page or two, because you get your little Bizarro piece whenever there's the reveal that the death of Clark Kent with the
killing of Clark Kent.
Yeah, yeah, killing is a very strong word for a DC comic. You're right, man. On the cover especially. You have the what is his name? The Toy Master or something like that?
Yeah. Toy Man and the Prankster.
Toy Man and Prankster. And then the thing I appreciate most about like whenever Alan Moore is playing around with this stuff, he always gets the credit for revising Swamp Thing and all of that. That's been talked about to death. But just in like mere sentences, he's able to add far more dimension to any of these Superman villains than anybody has been able to crack. Like all that time
totally.
up to this comic's creation.
Like when Bizarro dies, it's like with everything in this comic, I really feel it. Like it's like a beautiful and logical death for him, but it's also like really tragic and sad, like how he can't just stop being who he is and dies because of it. It's crazy.
Yeah, and he's only in this for like 7 panels.
Yeah, it's not long.
And we get an introduction to him. He's gone on a rampage, and then he kills himself, and that is enough to still get a strong emotional response out of us, the readers.
Whenever they would put out like fresh issues of a Batman or a Superman, they would never make distinctions between the villains. It was like every Superman has to literally save the world, like every issue or something. You know what I mean? Like it's all got to be for such big stakes and all of that. And you know, when we have like the Toy Man and the Prankster, just like the little level of thought that Moore adds to the piece when he's just like, oh, these are like my nuisance villains, you know, like low tier knucklehead douchebag villains. You know, what happens when the killers come around, you know? So just like laying on some distinction between like the hierarchy of villains is a fun touch.
Yeah,
definitely. But Ed, I mean, these villains that are basically a joke do wind up sending the dead body of Pete Ross to Superman in a fucking crate. Right. So that's something that I don't know if you would see in old school Superman comics. Like that moment in this part of the book kind of had I had a reaction to that where I was like, oh, this is almost like a little dark kind of Alan Moore thing creeping in here of like, and now here's a corpse of one of your friends. Yeah. You know, that seems a bit out of place, but then you realize like, okay, this is a story that Alan's telling where there are going to be real things happening, real stakes, and people will die.
Yeah, there are stakes and like there are costs and there are like, yeah, way more. It's weird too, because like you're saying, Ed, like, you know, Superman has to save the world in every issue. And then in this one, you know, he can't prevent or know that his friend is dead. And that just like one person dying it feels like it carries so much weight. And I don't know, it's just Moore is able to sort of convey that.
Once again, we don't have to like keep on like the page by page piece. And these are old comics from 1986, man. So have no fear about talking about any kind of like spoilerish moments or anything like this, man.
Right.
But you know, Swan has been drawing Superman for a very, very long time. And Alan Moore, you know, sends in his scripts for Kurt to draw. And there, to me, there's like, there are these articles and books. Like basically, if you spend enough time in an airport, you can read a lot about salesmanship at the little Hudson Bay fucking bookstores that are in every shop. And
right.
I remember reading this one about like the psychology of sales, and it was talking about the yes ladder, where you know you when you see a mark, you engage them in conversation and you get a bunch of little yeses, and then you sell them the Mercedes-Benz at the end. You know what I mean? Like, you know, do you like leather? Yes. Like that kind of thing. And I think that is the relationship between the Alan Moore script and Kurt Swan. And it's like Alan Moore knows that because it's an older dude. Now we're going to have a pretty standard, you know, in terms of the art, like Superman comic for 75% of the way. But then we're going to have fucking Crypto full of, you know, Kryptonian cancer or whatever from kryptonite is going to like, you know, bite a guy to death. We're going to,
right.
Yeah.
We're going to have Alan Moore. I mean, we're going to have Lex Luthor get a fucking karate chop that snaps his neck and kills him.
Yeah.
But the body's going to reanimate with that broken neck and look really disturbing.
Yes.
When you talk about the naturalism of Kurt Swan, when he has to deviate from it, it's almost like trying to drive on the wrong side of the road or something like that, where he still abides by bone structure and how far the neck could go, but with the knowledge he has of like academic drawing, those Lex Luthor sequences with the broken neck pre-rigor mortis are really fucking creepy, man.
Yeah. Like I'm not going to pretend to know what Swan's like feelings about drawing that subject matter were, but he, if anything, was like super professional about how he went about his job drawing Superman. So I can imagine him just being like, this is what I got to draw. It says it in the script. I'm just going to do what I got to do, you know? The way that he approached it, his art style really never changed, like from day one to the last one in these issues. And he's not one for like experimenting or like deviating from the process. So, you know, he had to draw a lot of really weird shit back in like the 70s and all the time leading up to here. So yeah, I could see him welcoming the change in like subject matter to draw, but at the same time, you might be right, Ed. It might have been like leading him on into some murky depths.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to find out if the two of them ever like had a phone conversation or something. You know, man, to be a fly on the wall for that would be amazing. Or maybe he just got the script and was like, I'm a professional. This is what I'm drawing. I've drawn a ton of these comics. Like, let's do this and get the job done, you know?
Oh, I was just keeping on the Luthor tip, man. Whenever he still is, you know, has a working body, but Brainiac takes over. Curt Swan really sells the kind of zombie Luthor posture really well. Like, you could see how good he is at drawing just figures, you know, walk cycles and shit.
Yeah.
But the Luthor zombie walk cycle when Brainiac first takes over, not the true zombie that we see later. It's really good. It sells the Frankenstein kind of piece and works really good with the dialogue that Moore provides, where it's like left, you know, take one step, now another, now another, now another. Like all of that like adds up to a very cool, creepy thing.
Yeah, I gotta say that the second issue, which is inked by Kurt Schaffenberger, is who's like more of a traditional Swan inker. Man, he handles this is actually the way that I prefer Swan to be inked. Just going back and looking at these two again, it just is like a lighter touch. There's like way more air in the panels.
Oh,
you know,
for sure.
There's way more area for like the colorist to sort of do their job. And it's just way more readable to me overall.
Yeah, I mean it's a more traditional, old school brush technique. Leave it open, leave it breathing. Where I'm assuming George Perez was probably inking with some brush, but lots of pen.
Yeah,
to that detail. And you know, I dig both a lot. I think they both have their own unique look over Curt Swan, but this second chapter, you know, has a more kind of traditional appeal to it, you know.
It's interesting down to the color between the two, because time is money, and the color separator, you know, has to get the work done within the allotted amount of time and all of that. But like when you look at the first piece with the George Perez inking and a million little characters and all of that, like the treatment of the color is far different when it comes to the separations. Now, let me see. Like I'm sure I would bet that there are two separate colorists. Let me just same colorist.
Wow.
So that adds a layer to it, man, where it's like even the color is able to change a little bit when you have a more airy artist, you know, who isn't putting a lot of filigree all over the page.
Gene D'Angelo is the colorist.
Yeah. Back to that Crypto death, the death of Crypto.
Yes.
Man, that's a really sad moment in this book.
It is. Like the final sort of you know, act of vengeance or whatever that the dog commits by killing that Krypton character, whatever that
Crypto Man. Yeah, Krypton Man. Whatever. it can slide past you, sort of like what really happens there, because this is a Comics Code Authority book. Yeah.
Yes, I was going to bring this up.
Yeah, talk.
Where it's like, well, there, this moment is a dramatic moment that this is a direct opposite of what we saw in Miracle Man when the miracle dog is brutally biting and murdering people and chewing off and biting off limbs of people. This attack from Crypto, it's like, well, the kill happens off panel. So the first time you read this, the first time you're kind of observing this, it's like, well, wait, what happened? Okay, I guess he bit Kryptonite Man. Kryptonite Man is laying with a pool of green, I guess, blood coming out of him. And then Crypto, you see, is turning greener and greener. He's been infected by this kryptonite, and then he also dies. So, this is like DC has always been a bit more conservative. This is a Comics Code Authority approved book. So I wonder how much discussion and editorial guidance had to go into this page of laying it out, where Kurt Swan was like, do I actually show fangs like biting into a neck, or what can I get away with here? Because to me it gets not wonky on the storytelling, but it's a bit odd.
Very restrained. Extremely restrained.
That's the word. Yeah.
And down to the tongue of the poor dead dog. Like, I think if any of the three of us had to draw that poor dead puppy, that tongue would be a part of the storytelling of that carcass, man. And they let just even a little bit of it show.
Yeah. Every death that happens in this book, you really feel the impact for every one of them. I remember reading this the first time and feeling really bad for Supergirl in like the first chapter,
right?
Where she doesn't realize that her counterpart in this timeline is dead.
Yes,
and everybody's sort of protecting her from that information. That I remember reading and feeling like this is very clever on Moore's part, using this sort of like narrative logic to then give us insight into who this character is, and then the characters around her and how they're treating her with this information.
Yeah, really, really good sequence. They really like kept it going far longer than they needed to in a way, because if it would have been far shorter, to me it would have had so much more poignance. Like, basically cut 2 pages out of it, because there's the initial part where he's with the dog, and there's the memorial statue of Supergirl. And then the very next page where she comes and he's having that conversation with her. And then he's just like, oh, let's go this way. The light's better here. And it's like protecting her from seeing the memorial statue.
Yeah.
If it was just that is like so subtle and perfect. You don't need the next page or 2 of them just like keeping the joke going or whatever, keeping the whole piece going about like she's dead and she doesn't know it, blah, blah, blah. But if we had to make a storytelling argument for it, it has to do with, Superman being given his memorial piece and not being told, when and how he's going to meet his maker.
Right. Yeah. They're sharing that same thing, except Superman sort of knows that it's happening to him,
right,
at that time. And then, it's pretty devastating seeing Superman crying at the end of that issue.
Yep. Lots of odd moments in these 2 books. And since Tom is not here with us, I thought I'll stand in for him and bring up a strange psychosexual moment where on page 12, there's Perry White and his wife have been estranged. They're not getting along, and they feel like they're going to die, and the Fortress of Solitude is collapsing. And there's an odd moment where it's these 2 elderly people, and they're like, oh, we both still love each other. And his wife is like, if we still have time, why don't we go to my room and make up for lost time? And I was like, did Alan Moore fit in a scene in this book of Perry White like fucking his old wife for one last time before the shit hits the fan? I guess maybe he did. I mean, he's alluding to this. So even in the end of everything, the shit's hitting the fan, Fortress of Solitude collapsing, people dying, there's still this element of human emotion and human connection through. It's kind of a cliche story trope, but it's like, world's coming to an end, let's fuck. You know, it's like that weird thing of like, who would you call? Who would you hook up with in your friend group or whatever? It was just a moment that I completely forgot about, and rereading this, it kind of took me aback a little bit, but it's kind of charming and funny at the same time.
It's actually a theme that I think that Alan Moore explores throughout all of his work about human beings, or just living creatures having the desire for sex, no matter what age they are, no matter what orientation they have.
Good point.
You see it in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, you see it in Swamp Thing. A plant even has these desires, and a woman has a desire for a plant creature. And he just is like, sex is a very natural thing, obviously, throughout like the characters and throughout all of his work.
Right.
And it's just funny to sort of see it pop up for a very brief instance in even this story.
Yeah, and these two characters in particular, it's like, hey, in the DC universe, even old people still want to have sex.
Right,
it's okay.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not just reserved for like the young, like hot superheroes.
Right.
In that last part, there's the page wherever that dome gets put over the fortress, and then you start to zoom in a little bit. You see little explosions. You see like those like little G.I. Joe vehicles, and then you see like the little superheroes trying to punch to get in. To me, that's like the most childish, like that's the stuff that I was drawing when I was like in third grade, man. Like where like you're drawing this like macro view stuff, and you're drawing these big scenes with like super tiny little characters, and playing out these big moments, and that's what that made me feel like, man. Just seeing like all this stuff happening at such a microscopic viewpoint.
For me, I love that panel of the dome over the Fortress of Solitude. It's so simple. That is quintessentially Kurt Swan to me.
Right.
Like just that shot, it's just like, all right, this is where we are.
Yeah.
And it's delivered without any kind of like excitement in the drawing
Yes.
at all. It's just like
completely.
This is an instructional comic right now. And
it gives you everything you need.
Yeah.
That's it.
That's what I love it for.
It makes me wish that we could have seen like further developments of the relationship between Alan Moore and Swan when it came to future storytelling possibilities, man. Because Moore's getting a lot of mileage out of him, man. When like the fight sequence happens with Jimmy Olsen and Lana, where the karate chop is delivered to Lex Luthor's neck. It's a beautifully composed sequence with 10 characters moving about in space, and we're able to kind of keep conscious of like where everybody is during the action. My favorite stuff is that Jimmy Olsen shit with the crazy limbs, man, climbing up on things and all that.
Yeah.
Like that's just a cool batch of drawing, and I think part of what makes it cool is just that it doesn't abide by 8 heads tall. The eyes are X number of spaces apart. Like it's the closest we could get to him playing with drawing.
Definitely.
A lot of like when I was a little dude like buying comics, the reason why I gravitated to like McFarlane and Liefeld in those like late 80s, early 90s was because it just looked different than all the other stuff. And a part of like what made it look different was kind of like enthusiastic, amateurish qualities,
Yes.
And like that's the closest we could see to anything that deviates from the norm from Swan in this couple of issues.
With those Marvel artists, they were just bringing like this intensity that you just didn't see in a lot of DC books, you know.
Definitely not.
And like it like used reserved the term reserved earlier, and that's exactly what it felt like looking at DC books. It almost felt like these artists didn't want to be drawing these books, you know, like some of like these like generic artists, I'll just classify them as generic or straightforward artists. Right. It just, they didn't feel like they were as into what they were working on as like a McFarlane drawing Spider-Man and just like really just drawing the hell out of everything. And just you could feel like the emotional investment of McFarlane in the books that he was drawing, and even Jim Lee too. Oh yeah, definitely Liefeld. There was just some sort of like energy to those that was lacking in DC books, which I feel like Swan's work personifies. And it's funny because now in my older age, I just want to look at Swan stuff. Right. No, it's really weird.
Well, your taste and your palette have developed full circle to now where you can go back and see the drawing skill and the craftsmanship in both old, new comics, you know, the McFarlanes, the old guys. So it's sort of like it's age relative and it's also taste relative to where you're at. And I feel like the three of us, like we've been around the block long enough. We've looked at enough comics and studied enough different styles that we can sort of approach each era and each movement and style with an open mind, you know, and know what to cherry pick from each movement, if you want to call them that, each style, each era, you know. Looking at this stuff, like even the Lex Luthor figure that Kurt Swan's drawing with the Brainiac helmet on his head, I mean, that's just an odd thing to have to draw. And looking at what he's doing, he's pulling it off so well. I mean, it looks like this helmet on this guy, and it's controlling him. Like, I don't know. There's certain artists that I don't know if you could if that would read as well. You know, so
if it was a Marvel book, he would also be decked out with like crazy shoulder pads and like all these straps, and like he would be like ripped like crazy. But in this, he's just wearing like an Oxford shirt and like some khakis, you know.
That's what I mean. That makes it even like stranger, basically. Yeah. But I like that, you know. That I think that works for this for sure.
I don't like watch any of the Superman cartoon or whatever, so I never heard the character's name said in real life. But I call him Mr. Mixelplick, so I'll just call him that. That's fine. Through a conversation, and I think, you know, like it's like, how do you make these characters work? And it goes with what I said a little bit earlier about, you know, when he would introduce these guys and add like a little bit more dimension to them. I can't imagine any harder character to try to like think through and give like some good motivation for than that little douchebag character. And Moore handles it in 5 panels.
Yes, it's great.
And it's awesome, man. It's pure imagination, and you know there's like it's almost like there's like a governor on our brains, man, that kind of like prevents us from going too far outside of our own world or our own logic and shit. And Moore just seems so adept at being able to be like, okay, well, if you're around for 1,000 years, like, how would a person who's been around for thousands of years think? Or an immortal person, like, how would that work? Well, you'd probably get bored every 1,000 years, and you know, you might not even get out of bed for the first 1,000 years if you didn't have to.
Yeah. He makes a point of saying, I was in stasis the first couple thousand years of me being alive. I did good things for couple thousand years. I did bad things. And I'm bored now. I'm here just to fuck with you. You know, so it's like you said, man, it's like he breaks down this kind of silly, stupid character in just 2 pages, and it makes complete sense, and you're interested in what Mitsaplik's motivation is, you know. And I don't know if he's ever been seen in this form before, or if this is an Alan Moore, Kurt Swan creation, Mr. Mitsaplik's true, like, weird demonic form. But I mean, that's if that's something that Alan Moore specifically added to the mythology of this character, then that's also fantastic.
I have to say, with some of the stuff that I'm working on at this very moment, this 2-page sequence with Mitsaplik, like, has changed my thoughts about, like, some of the future developments in my story. In as much as let me just, like, think through a character or two far more so that I can give them some suitable desires that they're really shooting for, rather than just being strawman characters or just like, here's the bad guy, which wasn't the case anyhow. I'm just saying that, like, reading these 2 pages, it's like, you know what, I need to put a little bit more thought into these characters because I know that I can make them more rich. Nobody's ever, you know, one thing for that long. I'm dealing with, like, real, like, harsh subject matter, but you can't. There's got to be other elements to a person's personality. Like, let's get some of that in there, and it'll just make a more interesting character.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Even if they're just saying, like, a few lines of dialogue, if you have that information about that character internalized, that dialogue is going to reveal, just even unconsciously, reveal more about the character than they probably would have if you hadn't thought about that stuff before. Yeah,
very instructive piece. And that's sort of what I get from revisiting this Alan Moore work, is just like a set of marching orders. What I would say is, like, conscious incompetence. He's letting me know the things that I do not know as a writer. And I don't want to speak for everybody here, but whenever I first got into comics, my goal was to learn to draw them shits, man. So, like, the writer part of my brain is far less developed than the artistic part. And having these kinds of conversations, like really adds to basically my list of things that I need to focus on to just become stronger in that department.
Definitely, I agree 100%, man. And it is interesting and sort of ironic that 3 guys that are probably known more for their visual art than their writing are doing videos about a writer, about Alan Moore, you know, but it's, this guy is the exception, and he's kind of like the gold standard in a way, but he writes like the best visual artist would write. You know what I mean? Like, he knows how to tap into it. And it also helps that he was a visual artist earlier in his career. Like, he actually drew some of his earliest efforts. So
did you get a chance to check out some of that stuff that I sent over, man?
Yeah. And, you know, there's certain artists like him and Grant Morrison. I think eventually they just sort of realize, like, the scripting, the writing is really what I'm best at. I'm just going to go in this direction. And the better they got at writing, the more incredible artists they were able to team up with to bring their vision to life. So how exciting must that be for them to be like, okay, well, I can't draw this shit, but I've got some of the best people in this industry now drawing my crazy ideas, you know?
I think that's what makes them as good as they are, or masters of the medium, is the fact that they can think of comics as both visual and textual medium. Mm-hmm. Like, and even more, you know, like, he would sometimes for certain projects provide layouts for the artists to understand sort of like his thinkings about panel structures and like, you know, panel flow and just like the way that the information was going to be delineated on a page. And I feel like comic book writers should have to do that always in order to understand just how the art is going to, like, break down and what responsibilities for which portions of the narrative should belong to the visual side and which portions should belong to the textual side. But also, like, text is a design element on the comic page. You need to reserve real estate for that shit. So, like, and I don't think a lot of comic book writers even are aware of that, you know?
Right.
Before we clicked on the record button, we were talking about some of the nightmares that we've had in the commercial arts field with, dealing with certain kinds of people who had certain expectations. There's a whole nother kettle of fish when you talk with people who are tasked with, penciling comics written by writers who have never written for comics before and don't know the limitations of what is even possible in one panel. You hear horror stories constantly. You go to enough conventions about, people wanting, some sort of, a war to happen between, Pluto and Earth on one panel, and then, zoom into, some apartment complex, in the same panel or some bullshit like that, shit gets all over the place. But, the fact that Moore and these guys had, their time doing some drawing and pacing out the stuff visually, that just rewired their brain, or we'll put it this way, wired it in a way that made them more empathetic in terms of what can be possible with that comic panel.
Yeah, most definitely. And final note on this stuff from me is we're given a happy ending with this where, Superman is alive and he's married to Lois, and their little baby obviously has Superman powers. He's like grinding coal into diamonds and stuff. And it's something, again, that Alan Moore can only kind of pull off. He's the only one who can kind of pull off this sort of happy ending. It could have been so mishandled or cheesy or silly in someone else's hands, but it's done in a way where it's a really great and rewarding ending to this version of old school Superman. And that's it. After this, it's basically rebooted as the John Byrne 80s Superman, Yeah.
As a whole. Even in the mainstream current comics, like, this version of Superman is still around, messing around in the regular DC universe, which is...
Oh, really? Oh, shit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, which makes it not really an ending in some ways, but in comics, that's kind of par for the course.
Okay.
Pretty fun to me, just imagining all Alan Moore comics as one universe, in that not too dissimilar aesthetically from The Comedian.
Mm. Yes. Okay. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. White on the sides of his hair and everything.
Yeah, Ben, do you have any final notes?
No, nothing really, other than that reading these issues has really made me look at Curt Swan again in a really serious way. I've been kind of looking for some inspiration recently in this sort of vein where it's just very kind of disciplined, classic cartooning for comics that just doesn't, that is for color, that isn't so reliant on heavy shadows the way I've been working a lot of the time. So it's just so refreshing to revisit these stories and get a chance to reread them, and just be reminded at how good Moore is at writing dialogue and just how fun they are to read.
One of my great strategies in life is to make sure that I acquaint myself with people who I consider to be way smarter than me, so that I can pull information and glean some of their expertise for my own practice. And very happy to sit here with you guys, talk about these classic old comics, give me lots more food for thought when it comes to application in my own practice. And I am sure that the Cartoonist Kayfabe audience appreciates your wise words just the same. Without further ado, we could get the fuck out of here, fellas.
Let's do it.
Mahfood, why don't you start off and give the people some plugs, man?
Yeah, Jim Mahfood on Instagram and Twitter, jimmahfood.com, and check out Pop-Up Funk Kickstarter. You can Google that. We're kickstarting my pop-up book, and you can support that if you feel like it.
Super awesome. Ben, how about you?
BenjaminMara.com, and you can just search for me on Instagram or Twitter. I'm there. My books are in comic book stores and online at Fantagraphics website, and also on Amazon.
And the good people can also look in the description of the video below. They can find links to all of your stuff. They can also, you guys can sign up to the Cartoonist Kayfabe e-newsletter. Jim and I started putting those suckers out probably once every 2 weeks, so it doesn't spam your inbox in any crazy way. And I've been including some artwork that has never seen the light of day, some script pages that are basically just very rough versions of the comics that you see out on the stands or on the bookshelves, sort of at the comic shop. Way to get some together, man. So I've been serializing those delivered directly to your email. Without further ado, let's get the heck out of here, man. We'll have another video next week. In the meantime, read more comics.